are taught, learning how to have a conversation, having empathy, again, time management, being flexible. I worked the register, I worked the drive-through, I made lattes, and days were crazy. I mean, some days it was absolutely crazy. And even in my healthcare, my clinic job, I worked the front with scheduling, I worked the back, I drew labs, I did EKGs. I was everywhere. I was anywhere and everywhere. And I did everything. And I learned anything and everything that I could. And then I applied that later on.
Welcome back to the Edge of Excellence. I'm your co-host, Sean Phelps, president at CollegeWorks, and hosting today for Matt, who's out. I've got an awesome guest that I worked with back as a college student in Kansas City, Dao Ho. And Dao is going to share with us today what a career in saving lives is like at a cancer center, one of the world's leading cancer centers in New York City. Dao got into Yale University's Master's in Medical Science program and now spends her days living in New York City, saving lives. And we're pumped to have her on the show to talk about what it's like to get into the top medical programs, what her life was like early on when she was our listener's age, and what inspired her to go save lives at a cancer center, and what it's like day to day in what she does now, and any advice she has for the audience. So thanks for joining us today, Dow.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
So good to see you again. And this is my favorite part of what I do, is getting to see people grow up and see them go from motivated, young, excited college students to then, successful adults. And it's a ton of fun. So I'm pumped to see you again.
Yeah. I mean, I was looking back and I guess it was 10 years ago that I started. So that's really crazy. I mean, I'm rounding 30. I'll be 30 this summer, and I was 19 when I started this. So that is actually crazy to think about.
Absolutely. And life flies, right?
It flies.
We always like to start off with taking back to where things started and, what you were thinking about doing in terms of careers when you were young. Our listeners are trying to figure out, what do I want to do? Maybe they're a biology major interested in possible different medical fields, and they might go into medical sales. They might go wherever. What did you want to do when you grow up, when you were a kid?
So when I was younger, I mean, actually, I wasn't sure for a long time. I watched a lot of CSI Miami, and I wanted to be a forensic scientist, something kind of along that nature. And then in high school, I took an anatomy class and I was like, hey, maybe I want to go into medicine. But I actually didn't know exactly. I knew there was so much out there. So my first year in college, I went to SLU and they had an introduction to medicine class. And I remember there was a panel and there were a bunch of medical professionals. They had like dentists, pharmacists, and there was a PA on the panel. And I liked what she had to say. And I said, okay, I'm going to think about it. And then after my first year, I actually transferred back. So I went to UMKC the rest of my undergrad. And so I thought about being a PA. I looked it up and I was like, okay, I think this makes sense. This is the path for me. And I knew even at that time, it would be hard to get in. The admissions process was hard. You need a lot of experience. And I didn't really have much experience in medicine yet. And so, in school, I cared about making sure I met the minimum criteria. So making sure, my degree was in chemistry. I had a major in chemistry with minors in biology and Spanish. So I met, the academic criteria, but I wanted to make sure the rest of my resume was strong enough for me to get into PA school. And so I did a lot of extracurriculars and I took a gap year and I applied to PA school and I got into my number one choice, and the rest is history.
So let's go all the way back to that. When you're in college, what were some of the things you were getting involved in before you applied and before you had your resume and application completely filled out? What were you kind of adding to your resume to be prepared for that?
So for me, I always thought that it was important to volunteer. That's something I still do now to this day. I find value in that, spending my time outside of work, outside of kind of my personal life, just to give back to the community. So I volunteered at a number of places. I did youth group on Sundays. I volunteered at Hope Lodge, which is essentially housing for cancer patients, adult cancer patients. I volunteered at Ronald McDonald House, which is similar aspect, but for children with medical needs. I volunteered with hospice. I walked some dogs here and there. But then my working job, things that would give me actual, paid experience. I did college works. I worked as a tech in a hospital, which I did for several years, and I worked as a barista. And so,
If I
college
remember
works
right,
was,
you were kind of doing them all at the same time
I
too.
was doing everything at the same time. One thing I learned, I remembered. So, college works, people were like, what are you doing? Like, why are you not spending all of your time, like dedicated to medical experiences? Like, don't you want to learn more? And I agree with that. I mean, I did work as a tech, but as you'll learn in a second when I talk about it, I also made a very conscious effort to do things that would help me, not just in medicine, but in life. And I think college works, I never want to paint a house again. I never want to touch a can of paint again. However, the things that I learned, I mean, the resilience, the flexibility, the time management, especially the time management, are skills that you can transfer in any aspect of life. And that is what helped me succeed later on. So I did college works and I did okay. I mean, there were many of my peers who sold much more than I did, but I still had a good time. I mean, there were days where I was just knocking on doors for hours and hours and hours and got nothing. But I did not give up. I mean, I wanted to quit every once in a while, but I knew that I committed to this and I was going to see it through to the end, no matter, if I made 100,000 in sales or if I made 5,000 in sales. I was committed to the process, and that itself helped me a lot. And so I did that, 2016, fast forward, I, am going to school full time, but I took a course that was several weeks long to become an EMT. And I used that to become a tech in the hospital. And that is what gave me my healthcare experience. And it was only during the weekdays. And you could argue, I could find a second job that was medical related that I could do on the weekends. I chose to work at a coffee shop instead. The coffee shop was opened up by one of the nurses I worked with, and it was right by my house. I've always wanted to be a barista. I said, why not? And again, it was a choice to not pick a job that would give me more healthcare hours. So in the end, when I applied to PA school, I had maybe 800 healthcare hours and I had over 1,000 volunteering hours. And then I had all these other hours in jobs, between college works and my coffee shop job that, didn't really fit into a category. But the things that I learned, how to talk to people, because, that's not something you are taught, learning how to have a conversation, having empathy, again, time management, being flexible. I worked the register. I worked the drive-through. I made lattes, and days were crazy. I mean, some days it was absolutely crazy. And even in my healthcare, my clinic job, I worked the front with scheduling. I worked the back. I drew labs. I did EKGs. I was everywhere. I was anywhere and everywhere. And I did everything. And I learned anything and everything that I could. And then I applied that later on. And so when I'm volunteering, my last couple years of school, when I was done with college works and kind of juggling these two jobs in school, my Google Calendar looked like a rainbow. I mean, and I learned this from Sean, and I remembered you were all about the Google Calendar. And I was like, I don't really know if I believe in that. But once I use it, even now, like if I showed you what it looked like now, you would be shocked at the things that I have in my calendar. But I plan everything and everything, anything and everything. So every week, I remember in my last year of school, my last semester, I got a 4.0. I volunteered about 12 hours a week. I worked about 24 hours a week, and I was a full-time student. And I mean, if you told me that I was going to be doing that, a couple years before, I would be like, how does one do that? I still saw my friends. I would have to schedule in like when I'm going to see my friends because I had things to do that were important to me. But I also knew that it was important to have a life outside of work and school. So I made time to see my friends, but I had to physically make the time to do it. It wasn't like, I'll do it later. I'll do it later. No, I need to look at my calendar. I need to see when I'm free. And I want to make that, I carried that into my life now. Like even now, my work schedule is a little bit weird. I work about 3 12s a week. And so they're not traditional time frames. So, when I want to see my friends who work like a 9 to 5, we have to schedule it out. Like that's what we have to do. But I've learned so much, and I still carry many of those things into my life now. And I think without that I would not be, I would not have believed that I could be where I am now.
That's awesome. So when you're looking at PA schools, I don't know if you remember what it was like, but what is the competition like? Because I think there's a balance here of some of our listeners are like, yeah, I'm just going to do undergrad and I'll just get in. And they don't know how competitive some of those programs really are. But then there's the other extreme where there's the student who's doing everything and they're trying so hard and they're so paranoid about, trying to get in, and they can probably calm down a little bit and go, no, if you just do these things, like you'll be okay. So were you the extreme, like I'm obsessing, I need to get in, or were you kind of naive to how difficult it would be?
I would say I was kind of in between. So I am a firm believer in confidence will carry you through. Like you need to believe in yourself because if you don't, it's going to be hard to convince other people to believe in you. So I worked really hard. I had planned ahead that I would take a year off. And so I knew my stats going in, academically, I probably was okay. My hours, again, I had like maybe 800-ish hours, which really looking back, a lot of programs now, I think they need like 2,000 hours. So like, I was like, not great there. But I believed in the rest of my resume. I believed in the experiences that I had. I believed in what I've learned and how I could apply that to PA school. So my application process was actually kind of funny because I applied, I kind of looked at all the schools and I was like, okay, these look like schools that would be reasonable, that I probably could get into, and I think I would probably enjoy. And I didn't even think about Yale because I was like, there's no way I would get in, and I don't want like a super rejection in my face. And then finally, one of my good friends at the time, he was applying to medical school and he got into Brown in Rhode Island. And he was like, if I can do this, you can apply to Yale. And I said, you know what? Fine. So I applied and I told nobody about it. And it's time for interviews. And I interview two of the schools in Missouri. One of them I interviewed early at, and I think my odds were like 1 of 4. Didn't get that. And then the second school I interviewed at, it was a 1 in 2 because I think they interviewed like 60 and 30 got in. Didn't get that. And I was like, all right, great. And actually that second school, I was on the wait list to be interviewed. I wasn't even like the first choice to be interviewed. And I was like, this is crazy. But then I get an interview at Yale and I was like, okay, fine. I go. And I almost didn't make it. I mean, there were a bunch of issues with my flights. My flights were canceled. My Airbnb was canceled. I worked around all of that. I get there, I get to the interview and it goes great. And I'm like, okay, I really hope I get in. I still continue to interview. And I remember I was flying back from an interview, walking through the Atlanta airport, not knowing where to go. And I get a call and it's from Yale. And it was my acceptance call. And I almost fell to the floor. I had a flight to catch and I was paralyzed in the Atlanta airport. And, I had no idea. I mean, I was like, I could not get into the 2 schools that I should have gotten into. And somehow I get into the top school that I almost didn't apply to because I didn't think I could do it. And so that was like, okay, I can actually do like really hard things. And, that went on into the future too. I've had things that I've done in the past, going into my career. I didn't really think that I would have a shot at the job that I wanted, and I got it, and now I'm here. So I think students, you can work really hard and, do everything right on paper, but you need to be able to prove to other people. Everyone looks good on paper. Like in these interviews, everyone looks good on paper. That's why you got to the interview process. The interviews are where you convince people with your stories, with your emotion, with your empathy, that you are the one that's right for this position or this spot or this, whatever it is. And I think, being able to talk to people is step 1. And then being able to explain to them why you are what they want is step 2. And I think, I learned some of that in college works. Like I had to convince these people to let me paint their house. And I don't know how some of them let me do that still. And I was 19, like just walking around asking to paint people's houses. And I think, you have to believe in yourself. And there are things to worry about. Like, yes, if you have a GPA of like 2.7 and, you aren't very strong academically, there are things that you could improve on probably. and come back and be a strong applicant. But you have to believe that you want to do that, and you have to believe that you can do that, and you will. Like, you will. You just have to believe that you win. You can do it.
That's incredible. How many students have like applied to one school just to see and didn't get in and then just like kind of picked a different career or gave up or thought, oh, this isn't for me because I didn't get it. And just to keep going, and the importance of diversify your investment. Like, don't ask in one application. Let's put a little bit everywhere. What did you change or do in the interviews? Like, is there something that you went, all right, these first two didn't go the way I wanted to, and now I'm warmed up and I'm going to go absolutely crush it in this interview?
I think, you definitely like start Googling like how to like interview correctly, or like what are the things to do. And there's so much out there. I think it's very overwhelming, as a student, especially if you're like nervous or, you had a couple interviews, they didn't go well. I say take every chance, every opportunity. I felt pretty good in my interview with Yale, but I was like, well, I have to keep going. I still was getting interviews, and I was still going to interviews, and I was going to keep interviewing. And it is hard with the timelines. Some schools have you commit. And I actually got accepted to a school before I got accepted to Yale. And they gave me like a 1-week grace period. So it was like a short turnaround, and I had to commit. And so, what some people do is like reach out to schools and say they're very interested if they're waiting between two schools. But I find that like, when you look up like things that could go wrong, or like what happens if you don't get in, I think you like start going down the wrong hole. Like, what if it goes well is what like I try to tell myself now. Like, what are all the things that could go well when this happens? Because I think once you start focusing on the negatives, it gets really hard to kind of claw your way out of that. And so for me, the first couple of rejections, they stung quite a bit. But then I got this, and I was like, well, this is what I was meant to do, really. But you ask around, you look for feedback, you ask. Every time I interviewed, I thanked people for the opportunity, and if there was any feedback they had to offer me. But I think in life, one of the quotes that I remembered learning, I think sometime in college, was fail often so you succeed sooner. So there's X amount of things that you have to go through to get to what you want to get to. And so, for example, if you're applying to schools, and if we had, if we could see the future and we knew that on your 10th application you would get in, and you're on the 5th one and you're like, oh, this sucks, like I'm just going to stop. Well, you won't know that on the 10th one you'll get it. So, and we'll never know in life like where we're supposed to end up. But I think, trying and working towards it. And I think something that's important is making a meaningful application, or making something that you're proud of. If you're like, oh, I don't know if I could get in this year, but maybe if I took another year, I say go for it. I say go for it. Wait for another year and make yourself very competitive. Make yourself, someone that you would be proud to get into. And I've met people in my program alone. I had a couple people who were almost 40. I've had people, this is their second career. And so it's never too late to change your mind. But if you believe in yourself and you believe that you can do it, you can do it.
That's incredible. So how did your well-rounded experiences of like, I don't just have medical experience, did that come into play in the admissions process and the applications?
It did. So, everyone coming in, you need some exposure to medicine to be a PA, especially just because of the education. It's an undergrad program and then about 2.5 years, depending on the graduate program, and then you're done. So they like you to have some exposure to medicine, which I did. But then, I had college works. I worked as a barista, and the things that I learned there, I still use as a PA now. Time management, which I learned very well for college works because I was doing all kinds of things for that. And so what I do now as a PA, I am managing many things, many patients, oftentimes many things at once, communication skills, which again, that's not really taught. I feel like you can't really teach someone. You can communicate, it might be easy to communicate with your friends, but how do you communicate with someone who's angry, a patient who's upset, a colleague who, is frustrated with you? etc., stuff like that. I mean, I was exposed to that, especially as a barista. I had plenty of customers who were unhappy. And if you've never dealt with an unhappy person in your life or someone who's confronting you until you get to, at bedside when a patient's family member is very upset, you're not going to know what to do. And so stuff like that, I basically turned every experience into something that would be helpful for me in the future as a provider. And I mean, you can say fake it till you make it, but I really felt like everything that I learned, as a barista, how to comfort people. I've had patients or people, I guess, when I was a barista, I remember one customer in particular, he came in every day, and he would hang out for hours and we would talk to him, we'd be busy and we would talk to him. And he came in every day, talked to us every day. And we found out, a little bit later, maybe about a year into it or so, he told us we saved his life. He had been feeling down, thinking about taking his life, but it was the conversations he had when he came in and talked to us every day that, convinced him not to. And that is something, we had no idea. We were just talking to this guy every day and, we're making coffee. We're saying, hey, how are you? Asking about his life, his dogs. But these interactions, they're very meaningful. And so for me now, when I'm taking care of patients, I'm taking care of people in the sickest and most vulnerable times of their lives. And to be able to comfort them and tell them, I'm here to take care of you. That, again, to do that with empathy is something that I think is learned and acquired with time as you interact with people, talk to different people, learn from different people.
That's incredible. And then, So you get through this application process, all your experience pays off. Now you're there. And that's a place where, somebody in the Ivy League and they're like, now that the imposter syndrome can kind of set in and go, wait a minute, what did I get myself into? And you probably experienced that a little bit as a college works intern too, of like, what am I doing here? And how's this going to go? What's it like for a student that's going into that experience, and what advice would you have for them to be able to be successful in a master's program at an Ivy League school?
I mean, the imposter syndrome was real because I, again, am just a girl from Missouri. I was born and raised in Kansas City, lived there my whole life, spent 1 year in St. Louis, and then came right back. And so I didn't even know where Yale was. I actually had to Google where that was. It's in Connecticut, in case you're wondering. Again, where is Connecticut? I don't really know. So, and of course, my parents, I'm a first generation Vietnamese American. And so my parents, when I told them I got into Yale, they were like, okay, like they had no idea.
What is it?
They were like, cool. So that was extremely humbling. My brother at least knew what Yale was, but they had no idea what I was doing. They had no idea what a PA was even. So I'm like, okay, this is a big deal, but no one else is really surprised or so excited. But that was grounding and humbling for me. But, with time, they understood what was happening. And now they're like, oh my God, my daughter went to Yale. And also with time, I understood how an amazing an experience like this would be. And so I wanted to, I still the first few days of school, I was like, I cannot believe this is real. But then I just got really excited. I got really excited about all the opportunities. Why did I apply to Yale? A lot of the perks about it, the opportunity to do international rotations, the opportunities for research, the opportunities for clinicals, all of those things are why I applied. And I knew that I had to take advantage of that to really make the most out of the experience. And with time, I'm grateful. I had really good friends and we're still friends to this day. The friend group that I had, we're planning a trip to Napa in a couple months. So it's been great. I had a really good time in PA school. I worked hard, but I played hard as well. Life is not just about work and school and work and school. I think I'm a firm believer in, there is more to life, and life is really short. So you should enjoy your life. You should work and enjoy that, but you should also do things make you feel fulfilled outside of just work and school.
Absolutely. And so I want to get to where you're at now too, and we can maybe talk about Yale more, but the cancer center that you're at, so one of the leading cancer centers in the world, you're dealing with bone marrow transplants and leukemia patients and taking care of people in a very vulnerable state. My mom was an oncology nurse for several years, and she couldn't really tell us. So I was in a small community in Illinois, and there'd be somebody who she treated, but because of, patient confidentiality, she can't come home and be like, "Oh, hey, your high school teacher has cancer," and they come in every Tuesday and Thursday for chemo. We had no idea. So people would come up to us and say, "Thank you so much. Your mom did a great job," when it'd be at like their aunt's funeral that we're attending, and we didn't know. So it's a really tough. She didn't do it forever because it was such a tough area of medicine to work in. So to kind of talk about that and how you got to, being at one of the world's leading cancer centers, dealing with some really complicated medical issues and like the abilities that you bring to that role.
So I didn't know. So I am a PA in bone marrow transplant and cell therapy. Didn't know what that was. Didn't know that existed until my last year of PA school, actually. And one of the things, so I've always had an inkling that I wanted to go into oncology and cancer because my grandpa had lung cancer, but I didn't really know, what to do with that information. So I get to PA school. The first thing we learned by system. So the first thing we learned was about the blood system, and we learned about blood cancers. And I was like, yep, I think that's what I want to do. And I gave the rest of the year a chance, didn't like anything else. Okay, great. So then we go into the second year. It's time to do our clinical rotations. My first rotation is inpatient hematology oncology. And I was like, yep, this is what I want to do. Don't want to do anything else. And so I was pretty set on that. Most of my rotations, my clinical year, that year and a half, was something oncology related. So if you had to do surgery, I did surgical oncology. And I was like, I want to do something in this realm. And actually, so this was spring of 2021, which is almost 5 years ago. They had opportunities to do rotations at other hospitals, including Sloan Kettering, but you had to apply. And because of COVID, there were restrictions and there were only a couple months that we could do it. And so I applied and I got it. And they didn't have like leukemia, lymphoma, which is what I was thinking, but they had something called bone marrow transplant. And I was like, okay, that's close enough, I guess. I had no idea what I signed up for. And so fast forward to August, I come to New York. Don't want to be here really, but fine, it's here. And I do this rotation. It's the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life. It was so hard. I was studying every single day and I still had no idea what I was doing, but I loved it so much. A little bit about bone marrow transplant. So the name is a little misleading, but essentially I take care of patients who come in for a stem cell transplant. And so there's kind of two buckets, but the main bucket I'll talk about is patients who have leukemia, for example. Their bone marrow, that's where your red blood cells, platelets, and white blood cells are made. If you have leukemia, you have a bunch of abnormal white blood cells. And then all the other cells decrease because you have a bunch of abnormal white blood cells. So your white blood cells fight infection, but now you have messed up ones. Your red blood cells carry oxygen. Now you have decreased red blood cells, so you're more tired. And platelets help with clotting. And now you have less platelets and now you're, bleeding more. So these patients go through chemo, but their bone marrow at its core is, messed up and making abnormal cells. So the goal is to get them kind of a reboot with someone else's cells, which is what we call a stem cell transplant. It's called a bone marrow transplant because they used to only be able to do it by going into someone's hips and taking out the bone marrow that way. But now the process is actually very easy. Patients can receive stem cells from someone else and they can come just from the peripheral blood. So to join the registry, it's very easy. I recommend everyone who's young to do it.
All listeners, go
get on the registry. It's very easy. It's just a swab on the cheek. It's very quick. And, you could save someone's life. So say you are chosen, they go through some medical screening and then you go to wherever the collection center is and you sit there. It's just like donating blood. So if you've donated blood, you can be a donor and this could save someone's life. And so I got to see patients who, honestly had a death sentence. If you cannot, live with proliferating disease forever. And so if this could be a cure for these patients, I like want to be a part of that. And I got to see patients, come in, they're perfectly fine. We take them through the trenches with the transplant, and then they come out on the other side and out they go to live their life. And we've seen amazing success stories. We've also seen really terrible, unsuccessful stories. And that's just the nature of transplant and what we do. Sometimes we want to be triumphant, but we can't. And we do our best to take care of these patients until, the time, there's nothing else we can do. And I think I find a lot of value and meaning in my job. I love the patients I care for. You really get to know these patients. They spend at least, 2 weeks up to several months. I've had patients spend 10 months with us before. And so, in that time frame, I'm managing anything that's transplant related that comes up, anything new that comes up. But I am there at the bedside with these patients. The nurses are like the backbone. They're in there doing the meds and turning the patients and cleaning the patients. But in terms of management of, if they have nausea, if they have a new infection, et cetera, I'm the one, figuring out what to do next and communicating that with the doctor.
Wow.
But yeah,
it's pretty heroic and pretty incredible. What's your favorite thing about what you do, or what kind of person would be best to go into that field?
I think you need a lot of resilience. And, I am a huge empath. And so I feel a lot of things. And, it's hard to feel all these things. And, like you said, like confidentiality purposes, I can't go home and like tell my roommate everything that happened to me today, or, tell my family like, hey, this happened to my patient today. But I think the experiences of just getting to know people and being able to help them in this moment, and especially the success stories, and success looks different in every patient. And I think being able to see those small wins, I've had patients one day they're feeling terrible, and then the next day their counts, the blood counts that patients have will go down, and then they come back up. And as they come back up, that's when they start to feel better. And just seeing patients feel better, seeing patients be able to eat again, drink again, move again. And everyone is so grateful. I think there's some degree of vulnerability. Cancer patients are like just a little bit nicer, I think, because, they know that they have, a possibly terminal illness. And I think they can see life through a lens that the rest of us can't. We think we're invincible, but life is really short, and then you die. So, I've had patients who worked their whole life. They're like, okay, when I retire, I'm going to go travel. And then they get a cancer diagnosis and their whole life is different. You can plan for things and then something happens. I've had many patients, especially early on in my career. I started when I was 25, and I had patients, I have two in particular that I think of often, who were also 25. And it's really weird to be 25 taking care of a 25-year-old. I had this patient, the outcome was that he did not make it in the end, but I remembered him so well. And I think about him every year, especially around the time of his transplant and again for his birthday. But he was, around same age as me. He was same age as me, but he had just started his career. He moved away, got this diagnosis, comes home, gets a transplant, does fine. But then the transplant didn't work. He had relapse and he passed away after a few months. And, to take care of someone, like I'm going to work taking care of you. And then you're supposed to be doing the same thing. You're supposed to be working. You're supposed to be having fun. You're supposed to be going out on the weekends. And here you are in a hospital bed. And he never got to, see what it was going to be like after transplant. And I think it's a reminder to me, live your life. And I live my life for myself, but I live my life for my patients too, who, may not be able to do the things that I do. I have a patient now that I took care of recently who he's just dying to get out and walk. He had a fall, he can't move as well, and he just wants to walk. And, when these days I'm running, I'm like, I don't want to run, but some patients can't even get up and walk. And so I'm very grateful to be able to do what I do. And meet the people I get to meet and hear, you know, about my patients and who they are as people, not just as my patients.
Wow, that's incredible. So when you're trying to achieve all these things and everyone here is trying to work hard and be successful in school and work and get into the top programs or get hired at the most competitive jobs, and to keep it into perspective, to understand, hey, life's short. Like, make sure while you're doing all that, you're stopping to smell the roses and you're enjoying it. It doesn't mean don't go out and chase accomplishments. You can chase accomplishments while doing them and fully appreciating them as they're happening, because you get to experience it and you get to live life. And that's pretty miraculous.
Yeah. I think, happiness is a choice. And I think you can do all the things right on paper, get the best job, make the most money. But at the end of the day, if you're not happy in that role, you can change that and you can do something that's meaningful to you, because I've had patients who are very successful in their life. And then at the end of their life, no one is there at the bedside, as they are dying in the hospital. No one visits, but they were very successful in their job, but they did not keep up with any of their friendships, any of their relationships. And now there's no one there. And at the end of the day, I think that is very important to me. I'm reminded of it every day. I think, day to day, people may not think about that, but I think, doing things that are meaningful to you in a way that, yes, we want to be successful. Like I want a job that pays me a good amount of money, enough to make me, feel like this is worth it. But also I don't want to work every day of my life. And then at the end of my life, I'm like, wow, wish I worked more. Like, that's not what people are thinking. So I think living a life that, little me would be proud of, and also future me would be proud of. And I think in that moment I'm doing that. But I think, we all need that reminder because, I think there's some quote out there that's like, whether you think you can do it or whether you think you can't do it, you're right. So if you think you can't do it, you can't do it. And if you think you can, then you definitely can.
Incredible. So what advice would you have for your 20-year-old self?
I would say really just believe in yourself, because it's you versus you. It's not you versus your neighbor. It's not you versus whoever, because you want to be the best version of you. And whatever you perceive to be as your reality is the case. So, if you don't think you can do it, then you're not going to be able to do it. And I think, you're competing against other people in the sense that, like, yes, if you're applying for a job, you're competing against other people, but you can always apply for another job. You can always do other things, but you want to be better every day. And I think more disciplined, have a good moral compass and be a good person. Because I'm really, at the end of the day, I'm just competing against myself, being better at things, because it doesn't matter if I am better at that person next to me. If I'm unhappy at the end of the day, if I got this job that I really hate, but I beat the person next to me, but I don't even like this job. So, I think it's important to know yourself and know what you want to do. I think it's easy to fall under the impression that you have to impress other people. And it's hard. I mean, it's easy for me to say that now. It is hard because, your parents have expectations, your siblings have expectations, your friends have expectations, and everyone is different. And take that into account. But, you're living your life. They're not living your life. And you have to be able to accept, the choices that you make every day. And you want to be happy with the things that you do in life, because again, it's short and you never know when it will change. I mean, I know people now who have done very tremendous, successful things. And then one day their life changes, things happen and you don't know what's going to happen. The world could explode tomorrow at noon and we wouldn't know it. So I think, making the most of your time, doing things that you would be proud of, and believing that you can do it and it will all work out.
Wow. So just for me, this episode is really inspiring because it gets me excited about the things that we're teaching and the things that we get to do. And that, time management isn't just like get organized so you don't get your homework in or forget to get your homework done, or so that you can like apply for that job on time or call that customer back. Time management is like so you can live a full life, so you can do all
Yeah.
the things you want to do, so you can achieve what you want to achieve in work, have the financial success you want to have, but also have time with your family and have time with your friends and live life to the fullest because who knows, what's around the next corner. So it's just like you can take those lessons from a business experience to the medical world and know how to handle a frustrated patient or a frustrated family member of a patient, probably who is more difficult, I'm guessing. The family member is probably harder to deal with than the patients.
It depends
Okay.
usually, but it depends.
So dealing with difficult customers, dealing with problem solving, figuring out how to do things efficiently, right? Just like when you have 2, 3 employees or crews trying to do houses at the same time. Now you've got multiple patients that you're trying to,
Yeah.
how do if I put this time over here and then this time over here, I want to make sure everybody gets taken care of. I got to be organized to do that. So you can take all these business skills and transform into the medical world. We can take all the medical lessons and transform back into the business world about meaning, about values, about relationships and investing time in the right things and living your own life and achieving your own goals that you're satisfied with and that you're fulfilled by. So this is an incredible conversation. I'm super pumped. Any last advice for the student who wants to, get out of the Midwest, go get into the Ivy Leagues and work at one of the world's leading medical facilities? Any tips or tricks that you want to leave with them, Dao?
I think just don't be afraid to fail. And again, confidence will carry you. So I failed a lot. I mean, I failed all the time in college works. I didn't get into the 2 schools I should have gotten into for PA school. I mean, if I had to go back and list every time I've been rejected, it's been a lot of times. Like I failed a lot of times, but I kept going. And you just have to keep going. And if you let that, deter you, then, something else, maybe something else is meant for you. But another thing that I have thought of that I remember is, when you're deciding between things, you're like, oh, I don't know if I should try again, or I don't know if, this would be better. Like I'm not cut out enough for this. So just make a decision. Like you don't have to make the right decision, just make a decision and then make that decision right. So, if you have 2 options to go to this school versus this school, you go to school A, you hate it at school A, you're like, oh my God, the other school would have been better. Well, you have no idea. You have no idea that the other school would have been better, worse, or the same. And I think like regret, like dwelling about the past is not going to help you. So you make a choice and you go with it. And if it's wrong, do it again and keep going again and again and again until you get the answers that, are right for you or good for you. Because if you just up and quit, well, that's not going to help you. And if you're going to sit and dwell about the past, that's not going to help you either. Take it, learn from it, move on, do better. And then you'll be sitting, on a Wednesday. I go to CrossFit at 3:30 in the morning. I wake up at 3:30. I go to CrossFit and then I come home and I sit here all day. But it's, like even my peers now think I'm a little crazy because my schedule, like if I go to work, I wake up at 3:30. I'm going to CrossFit. I go to CrossFit. I shower and then I take the train to work. I work all day. I go home. I go to bed. I rinse and I repeat. And they're like, why would you wake up and go to class that early? I'm like, well, there's no other time in the day to do it. And I'm going to do it before work because I want to do it before work. But, that's because I can do it. Most people would sleep in, but I wake up early, go to CrossFit, go to work, come home, go to bed early. And then on my days off, I can do whatever I want. So it's, you make the choices that work for you. And this works for me. And I love it. I'm already, done with the day and it's 11 o'clock. So it's great. You can do whatever you want.
Well, students, reach out. Most of the people on the show, their LinkedIn profile is linked somewhere in the episode notes or in the show notes. So if you need to ask Dao about any advice we don't have a ton of college work students that are wanting to be PAs, but some are, and some are maybe interviewing and thinking, I don't know if I should intern at this company because I want to be a PA. So if you're one of those, feel free to reach out, check with Dao. She is pretty busy because she gets up at 3:30 in the morning and works all day and saves lives. But if she gets a chance, she'll shoot you a message back and answer your questions. Hopefully it's only a couple people reaching out, maybe a semester. So Thanks a lot, Dal, for catching up. I really appreciate you joining us on the show today.